I do hope that there would be some book that all of us would be available here in this country for us to read about this, because it's a fascinating story of leadership.
Adwa, an African victory.
Now, I hope all of us know what I'm talking about. The Battle of Adwa. No.
On March 2nd, 1896, the world woke up to news that would shock and change it forever. Reports were flooding in from Ethiopia, where a decisive battle had taken place between an African army and a European army, resulting in a stunning victory for the Africans. The Battle of Adwa was the first defeat of a European power by an African army in modern times. Ethiopia became a symbol of African dignity and resistance.
We were very, very concerned about what we're learning at school. And they said what we learn at school is that as Africans, we've always been victims. They say that, look, we were victims of slavery, then we became victims of colonialism, then we became victims of apartheid, and even today we remain victims.
Certainly on the eve of the battle, the expectation is that Africa is going to suffer the fate of North America. It's going to be conquered and settled by European Americans. And everything that, one would say that common sense in the late 19th century says that this is the future of Africa. That Africa will undergo its own kind of manifest destiny and be Europeanized in the fullness of time. And what Adwa does is it raises a simple but very important question. It calls common sense about the future of Africa into question, raises doubts about it, and I think that's tremendously important.
And the reason why it's demotivated is because we are told that we're always victims. So there's nothing that is constructive or good that's going to come out of us, even if we try to change these bad things that we see. We can't succeed because we are always victims.
Let us remove the scars of history and be firm craftsmen of our faith, recognizing that the only people who can stop us now are we but ourselves. We have to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery and to build the future that our people want of us and to give them that pride that is theirs. And we must do so in the spirit and with the results of Adwa.
This is the story of Adwa, a story of African resistance, courage, and triumph. A story that still resonates today, more than a century later.
This battle was fought in 1896, at the end of February 1896.
So the Battle of Adwa took place in the Ethiopian highlands on the 1st of March 1896. And it was a confrontation between an Italian army and an Ethiopian army that resulted in a triumphal victory for Ethiopia and disastrous defeat for Italy.
And the Italians, coming out of the Berlin Conference, which you remember 1884-85, which then allocated, divided countries, African countries, and colonized, but not Ethiopia. The Italians thought they want this Ethiopia.
By 1884, the scramble for Africa was in full swing with the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. And so, the story of Adwa, a story of resistance, courage, and triumph, began to unfold, a story that still resonates today, more than a century later.
The Battle of Adwa was preceded by many other conflicts with the Italians. And some of it took place in 1895, October 1895. The General Baratieri, Italian, who attacked Ethiopian troops and defeated them and occupied certain points which were later, during that offensive on Adwa, were taken back by the Ethiopians.
In December 1894, Bakta Hagos led a rebellion against the Italians in Akele Guzai, claiming support of Ras Mengesha. Units of General Oreste Baratieri's army under Major Pietro Toselli crushed the rebellion and killed Bakta at the Battle of Halai. The Italian army then occupied the Tigrian capital, Dewa. Baratieri suspected that Ras Mengesha would invade Eritrea and met him at the Battle of Coatit in January 1895. The victory in this campaign, along with previous victories against the Sudanese Mahdists, led the Italians to underestimate the difficulties to overcome in a campaign against Menelik.
This General Baratieri, having got his glorious victory, returned to Rome. That's 1895. And on his return, he was hailed as a hero and received a standing ovation when he addressed the Italian parliament. And the Italian Prime Minister, the Prime Minister of Italy at the time, was a man called Francesco Crispi. And Prime Minister Crispi described the Ethiopians that had been defeated by General Baratieri as, I quote, barbarians whose material progress and spiritual salvation cries out for the high ministry of Roman civilization.
Baratieri also didn't know the true numerical strength of the Ethiopian army he faced, so he further fortified his positions in the Tigray instead of advancing. He tried to outlast Menelik, knowing that such a big army couldn't remain in the field indefinitely. But Baratieri had issues with his unit. Also, the faltering Italian government was pushing for a big victory overseas to stoke nationalist pride. So, the Italian government ordered Baratieri to attack.
Now, of course, Ethiopia then is a feudal country. The emperor of Ethiopia at the time of the Battle of Adwa was Emperor Menelik II. Now, before him was Emperor Johannes IV. Now, Johannes IV had warned Menelik when Menelik started talking to the Italians. He had warned him that, you know, these Italians have already occupied this part of Eritrea, and these are not people with whom to form a friendship. Because what they're after is taking over Ethiopia. We lose our independence. Emperor Johannes died, Menelik became emperor.
As Emperor Johannes IV focused on fending off foreign invasions and quelling internal unrest, the Italians continued to expand their territory into Ethiopia from Eritrea. The Ethiopian troops managed to defeat the Italian army at several battles, including the infamous Battle of Dogali in 1887, but Emperor Johannes was too preoccupied to take full advantage of these victories. Unfortunately, his reign was cut short in 1889 when he died fighting against a Sudanese invasion in his north.
The emperor, the Ethiopian emperor, a man named Menelik, was, in fact, in the beginning of the story, he's a provincial monarch. He's from a southern province called Shoa, and he's really someone who struggles to come to power as an emperor, in part by undermining the current emperor, a man named Johannes, who rules from the north. So Menelik is a scrambler. He's a guy who, in fact, enters into negotiations with the Italians early on in order to undermine Johannes in hopes of succeeding him.
Menelik II, the king of Shewa province, declared himself emperor following Johannes's death. He had been patiently waiting for this moment, having played the long game for the imperial throne. Menelik II, a shrewd and strategic ruler, had always kept close contact with European leaders, but never trusted their intentions. But he knew he needed allies within Europe if his country was to survive the coming calamities. So when he finally became emperor following the death of Johannes, Menelik wasted no time in signing the Treaty of Wakale with Italy in 1889 in the hopes of securing Ethiopia's boundaries and its right to pass through Eritrea, with the goal of stopping the fighting and establishing long-term peace with the Europeans.
It's not as though he's entirely ungrateful. Modern Eritrea, just to the north of Ethiopia, is in effect a gift of Menelik to the Italians for their support. But ultimately, he uses the Italians, and when he's in a position finally strong enough to resist them, he does.
In 1889, Italy and Ethiopia's Emperor Menelik II signed a treaty in which Menelik recognized Italy's claim to Eritrea in exchange for a loan of arms and money. This particular treaty was crafted in two languages, Amharic and Italian, with significant differences between the versions. The Italian version of the treaty designated Ethiopia as a protectorate, while the Amharic version stated that Ethiopia had the option to report to Italy when dealing with other European powers.
However, the Italians had a duplicitous nature, and they had two versions of the treaty. The Amharic version stated that Ethiopia could use the Italian government to conduct foreign relations if it chooses to, but the Italian version said it was obliged to, effectively making Ethiopia an Italian colony. Before the ink was dry, the Italians declared to the other European nations that Ethiopia was now an Italian protectorate, and all relations with Ethiopia must go through them. To most Europeans, Italy was one of the superior European races, and Ethiopia was part of the savage and barbarian continent of Africa, so they readily accepted this declaration. Menelik only discovered the difference between the Amharic and Italian versions of the treaty the next year, when foreign heads of state started returning his letters with apologies, stating that it was illegal to deal with him directly. Apparently, Menelik's translator, Ras Yosef, was working as a double agent for the Italians. Despite this setback, Menelik remained patient and focused on unifying the country. He made no overt attempt to cancel the treaty or cut ties with Italy or any other action that might lead to escalation. Instead, he launched a long and subtle diplomatic campaign against the Italians in their home turf.
Upon discovering these discrepancies, Emperor Menelik attempted to resolve the issue through diplomatic channels, but his efforts were unsuccessful. Consequently, in 1893, Emperor Menelik formally denounced the treaty. Emperor Menelik and his wife Taitu Betu, a shrewd opponent of European expansionism, prepared to defend their sovereignty. In addition to securing modern weapons, they launched a public relations campaign with the help of several Europeans sympathetic to their cause.
He wrote to many of the European countries establishing diplomatic ties. He used the long-held rivalries between European nations to buy weapons and ammunition. He even wrote to the Italian opposition, gaining some sympathy for his cause. His tactics were so effective that the French, Russians, and even the Italians themselves sold him guns and ammunitions he would later use to defend his country. These tactics of winning favor abroad later became a common tactic in anti-colonial movements. It was especially successful in Russia, which maintained diplomatic contact due to being angry at the Italians for trying to cut them off from a fellow Orthodox government.
During this fight against Italian occupation of their territory, Empress Taitu played a pivotal role in maintaining Ethiopian sovereignty. It is even reported that when an Italian diplomat cautioned her that refusing Italy's efforts to make Ethiopia a protectorate would result in a loss of dignity for Italy, she responded, "We too must retain our dignity. You want other countries to see Ethiopia as your protege, but that would never be."
ሰው ሞቷል ሰው ሊያድን ሰውን ሲያከብር በደግነት በፍቅር በክብር ተጠርቶ በክብር ይሄዳል ሰው ሊኖር ሰው ሞቱ የተሰጠኝ ሕይወት ዛሬ በነፃነት ሰው ተከፍሎበታል ከደምና ከአጥንት ስንት ወገን ወደቀ በነፃነት ምድር ትናገር አድዋ ትናገር ትመስክር ትናገር አድዋ ትናገር አገሬ እንዴት እንደቆምኩኝ ከፊታችሁ ዛሬ